So I have a special opportunity to introduce Deputy Secretary Blinken, but let me just say that back in January, the State Department reached out to us and asked us if we'd pull together a session alongside Stanford University, Google, and others, a session of folks from, sort of innovators and engineers from LinkedIn, from Google, from Facebook, from Twitter, from Microsoft, from Apple. Got to make sure I get all those in there. But and the notion was to spend a day rolling up their sleeves and saying, what can we do to make a difference when it comes to the education of refugee children? And the State Department had found that one of the great motivators for refugees to make that incredibly treacherous sea crossing to get to Europe, one of the great motivators was a desire to get an education for their kids. And so the question is, how can we deliver that? And how can we not just involve the public sector, but the private and social sectors as well? And what we didn't know were really three things. One, that we'd have an overwhelming response, and that people came ready with ideas and commitment. But the second thing we didn't know is the Deputy Secretary, Tony Blinken, would come out and spend the day with them, rolling up his sleeves, side by side, finding solutions together. And the third thing we didn't know is that he would actually leave an infrastructure behind. That is to say that Zika, who some of you, Zika, are you in the audience? Way back there, is now based in Silicon Valley to help coordinate efforts such as those. And so it's been a real sign to us of how personally committed the Deputy Secretary is and how institutionally committed the State Department is to engage us all. So it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Tony Blinken, the Deputy Secretary of State. Prior to being Deputy Secretary of State, he was Deputy National Security Advisor in the White House. He had served as National Security Advisor to the Vice President as well, to Joe Biden, and he had served on the Hill, on Capitol Hill, with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee back when Joe Biden was the chairman of that committee. Tony Blinken has got a really, I got to work with Tony Blinken also because we were on the National Security Council of the Clinton administration together as well. But I think the most important thing to know about him is that he is not just a profound strategic thinker and not just a highly effective policymaker, but he's just one of those guys who gets things done. So regardless of what his position is, what his title is, that's almost immaterial. He is somebody who believes in what he does. When he says he's going to take something on, he takes it on, and when he takes it on, it happens. So please join me in welcoming the Deputy Secretary of State, Tony Blinken.
Well, good morning to all of you. And Jane, thank you for a truly generous introduction. It's greatly, greatly appreciated. And to you, to the Global Philanthropy Forum, thank you for welcoming me and welcoming my colleagues here. As Jane said, we had the wonderful opportunity to work together for some years during the Clinton administration. And it's been a wonderful thing to watch as Jane has connected a global community of philanthropists and inspired a new generation of social investors. And indeed, a few months ago, we were able to collaborate here on the workshop that Jane told you about, trying to bring together humanitarians, entrepreneurs, coders, educators, to help think about how do we expand access to education for Syrian refugee children. And I think for me, that day was incredibly powerful because it underscored the importance, and I would say even the necessity, of harnessing the great reservoir of talent that exists within our innovation and philanthropic communities to meet our most pressing challenges. And that's exactly what we've been trying to do with the State Department, not only bringing the department into the 21st century, but connecting with this community in ways that help us advance a common mission. And when I think about everything that we're trying to do around the world, it's abundantly clear to me that we need this infusion of expertise, of imagination, of resources, now more than we've ever needed it before. You've all been talking about this for the last couple of days, but it was just about a year ago when the winds warmed, the water calmed in the approach to summer, and headlines around the world reflected the fact that there was a crisis at sea, as more than 1,300 souls drowned in the depths of the Mediterranean trying to make their way to Europe. And then for several weeks, a record number of men, women, and children from Syria, from Afghanistan, from Eritrea, from Somalia, from desperate communities across 2 continents, risked everything to crowd onto these flimsy boats of smugglers and embark on a crossing to Europe. Within months, even this exodus was eclipsed. As summer turned to fall, great rivers of humanity, displaced by war and shadowed by suffering, made their way into Europe with their children in their arms and their only worldly possessions on their backs. They echoed the footsteps of 60 million other people across Southeast Asia, across East Africa, across South America, who had fled their homes in recent years from conflict, from violence, from persecution. And in their journeys, maybe they even traveled along the very same paths that many of our own parents and grandparents or great-grandparents took to find sanctuary from war and a future for their children. They did that for us. And now the question is, what are we going to do for them? As you've probably heard over the last couple of days, if you put all of the refugees and displaced persons in the world today into one country, it would be the 24th largest country on earth, larger than South Korea, larger than Spain. 1 out of every 122 people on this planet are forcibly displaced. This is truly a global crisis. We throw around that term easily. This really is one of them. And of course, there are millions of more people on the move who don't fit neatly into any of the categories that we've established, who may not fit the legal definition of a refugee. They may migrate to escape poverty or generalized crime or violence, but they find themselves in danger and in need of assistance and protection as well. There are thousands of unaccompanied Central American children who make the perilous journey north to the United States, or the migrants and refugees from Burma or Bangladesh, abandoned by human smugglers without food or water on the Bay of Bengal or the Andaman Sea. We saw that so acutely last spring. A generation of Somali youth who've lived their entire lives in the Dadaab refugee camps in Kenya. This is a great wave of displacement. It's the largest since the Second World War, and is actually remaking the world that we're living in. It's changing our labor markets. It's putting pressure on local infrastructure and national borders. It's changing the nature and makeup of our communities. It's affecting our sense of security. Most of all, I think it's challenging us to live up to our common humanity. The last time we faced similar questions of epic political, moral, and human consequence in the very heart of Europe, our predecessors went to historic lengths to establish and then guarantee the rights of those fleeing persecution. This was not simply an act of altruism. Having just emerged from a global conflagration, our predecessors knew that we could not simply wall our nations off, cut our ties to each other, reserve our most cherished values only for some. They recognized, even then, 70 years ago, that in an interconnected world, global leadership was an investment not only in our shared humanity, but in our common security. And so they built an international order of institutions, of norms, of rules, dedicated to peace and dedicated to the progress of all nations. And within that system, they created the world's first legal protection regime for refugees and a global humanitarian system to respond to emergencies and crisis. Today, as we see these heart-wrenching images from around the world, there's also something very powerful and maybe no greater symbol of hope, of compassion, of life than the image of an aid worker's vest, a humanitarian's blue cap, a convoy's Red Cross or crescent. In support of this mission, the United States has been proud and indispensable in its partnership and, I would argue, its leadership. But here is the challenge. The humanitarian system on which we rely for so much and to which we turn when epidemics flare up or wars erupt, that system is under historic strain, buffeted by protracted emergencies, extreme natural disasters, and widespread displacement. Simply put, our existing structures and approaches are being overwhelmed by the challenge at hand. So our collective responsibility is to adapt and strengthen the international humanitarian system, honestly confronting its shortcomings while preserving the norms and the laws fundamental to its construction, international humanitarian law and principles, civilian and refugee protection, and of course, the foundation of human rights. So the crisis that we're dealing with now is, as I said, global. But what I wanted to do today, in the time that I have, is just to focus in on what's in the headlines around the world, and that's Syria, and the utility of thinking about solutions in terms of concentric circles, of which the innermost circle is Syria itself. 5 years ago, and some of us were just discussing this, Syria was in effect a middle-class country. Engineers, scholars, shopkeepers, farmers. Today, roughly half the pre-war population has fled their homes from violence and deprivation unleashed by the Assad regime. Now, of course, the single most effective thing that we can do to reverse this tide is to end the civil war in Syria. And that's something that the Secretary of State, John Kerry, is working on almost literally 8 days a week. And now we have the first glimmer of possibility with an agreement endorsed by the United Nations Security Council to pursue a political transition toward a peaceful and more representative Syria. But in the meantime, there are steps that we can take, that we are taking, and that we have to continue taking to help alleviate the suffering and reduce the drivers of flight, steps that will lessen the violence and increase humanitarian access. And as I said, we're making progress on both of those fronts. As a result of Secretary Kerry's unrelenting determination, we have a cessation of hostilities that is now held for over a month. Its imperfections are great, but it has defied expectations, and far more importantly, it has saved lives and improved the lives of Syrians on a daily basis. We've now seen a measurable decline in violence across much of the country, even as, in particular places, there remains acute conflict. Humanitarian assistance has also arrived now in communities that have been besieged and literally cut off for years from any kind of assistance, from food, from medicine, from basic sustenance. Since January, more than 45 convoys of life-saving supplies have reached 400,000 people who'd been out of reach before the convoy started. But there are still many, many towns and cities in Syria that are beyond the reach of the humanitarians. So we'll continue to urgently insist on unfettered humanitarian access throughout the entire country. At great personal risk, we have heroic partners in this effort, UN agencies, NGOs, local organizations that are doing everything possible to help those Syrians most in need, and they are reaching millions of people every month. But even as we've made this progress, we are deeply, deeply concerned about those areas that we're not able to reach, and the persistent denial of humanitarian aid, literally as a tactic of war. And also about the Assad regime's practice of removing badly needed medical supplies, including surgical kits, from the convoys that are going in, supplies that literally mean the difference between life and death. So working on that first concentric circle, we're also addressing the second one, because when a comprehensive solution is reached in Syria, it will mean more than the end of war. It will mean the beginning of an effort to rebuild a a monumental task that will fall not only to the millions in Syria, but to those who have fled to neighboring Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, that second concentric circle, these countries of first asylum. Like many of you, I've had the opportunity to visit with refugees in these first-line countries, to listen to them, to hear their stories. And I think probably like many of you, it resonates on a personal level, because so many of us come from similar stories of one kind or another. And in the case of my own family, a grandfather who fled the pogroms of Eastern Europe and started over with nothing in the United States. In Beirut, I visited a counseling center run by an extraordinary organization, Caritas, and they were providing services to mothers, fathers, children. And it was interesting because the mothers, fathers, and children were divided up into different rooms receiving counseling, advice, and support. And so I went from room to room. And the first room I visited had the husbands, the fathers in it. And if there's one word that jumps out at me to describe the feeling in that room, it was depressed. These were men whose dignity had been stripped away from them. They had been productive members of their communities, of their society, back home in Syria. And now here they were, despite the incredible generosity in Lebanon, but unable, for the most part, to work. And it had literally depressed them, and you could feel it like a dead weight in that room. And then I moved on to talk to the women, the mothers, the wives in another room. And there was actually an incredible crackling energy in the room, but it was one that was born, I think, of almost desperation. And the desperation focused on their kids. How would they be able to provide for them? How would they be able to send them to school? They were fixated on ensuring that their sons and daughters had an education and therefore a future. And then you go and speak to the children. And it's remarkable, as I think so many of you have experienced, because despite the extraordinary hardships that they've endured, they still retain this infectious sense of hope and optimism. And there was in their spirit a sense of incredible resilience, incredible courage, and some innate faith that better days somehow were going to come. But in many ways, their small shoulders are carrying the heaviest of all of the burdens. Today, roughly 3 million Syrian children across the region are not in school. It's an absence so long for some that they wonder if they've forgotten everything that they once learned. Local communities have generously opened their classrooms to these children, but you know that the level of need continues to vastly outstrip the resources that are available. There aren't enough teachers, there aren't enough schools, there aren't enough classrooms, and those that exist are deteriorating rapidly under the strain of double and even triple shifts. Compounding this challenge, adults very often don't have access, legal access, to employment, a reflection of how hard it is for local leaders, politicians, to stand up and say they want to give a job to a refugee when their own people don't have one. Without access to work, we know that parents struggle to afford school fees and transportation. Entire families may subsist on the meager wages earned by a child who can more easily work in the informal economy as a street vendor, as a farmhand, as a garment factory worker. And of course, if they're working in those conditions, they're also not in school. And they won't gain the skills or knowledge they need to become successful in their own lives, let alone rebuild their country. But that, all things considered, is the least of the concerns that we should have, because we know this too. Out of school, these children are susceptible to exploitation, to crime, to trafficking, to early marriage, even possibly to the siren call of extremism. Now, the good news for the refugees in this second concentric circle in these countries of first asylum is that the violence that drove them to flee Syria in the first place, that at least is gone. But as Jane said, these other drivers, a lack of access to education, a lack of access to work, that deprivation, that continues. And that indeed is what is pushing so many to leave not only Syria, but leave these countries of first asylum and go on to Europe. And there too, they are again putting their lives at risk on the fierce seas, packed into sealed containers of the truckers and smugglers. But if we can tackle these challenges, these access challenges of education, of employment, we can also lessen the overall crisis and make a difference. So that's why we're working with our partners to expand access to education and employment, to strengthen the resilience of local communities. We've renovated schools. We've trained teachers. We've provided psychosocial care. We've helped schools manage double and even triple shifts. Since the start of the crisis, the United States has provided more than $5.1 billion in humanitarian aid to the response inside Syria and across the region, in addition to development assistance to Jordan and Lebanon. It's hard, but our country partners are also doing what they can. Turkey has increased school enrollment from the start of the school year by 30% to 325,000 children. It aims to reach 450,000 children by the start of the next year, but that still leaves hundreds of thousands unattended. They've also begun to issue Syrian refugees work permits, allowing thousands access to safe and legal employment. Jordan has promised to double the expansion of double shifts to accommodate 50,000 more Syrian students, and seeks to expand work authorizations for up to 200,000 Syrians over the next several years. And in Lebanon, the government has proposed a series of investment initiatives to donors that they estimate would create a total of 300,000 jobs, 60% of which would be for Syrians, the balance for refugees. They're also aiming for the ambitious goal of getting all children, including Syrian refugees, into school by the end of next year. But we have to be realistic about the magnitude of this challenge for these countries. And we have to have a certain amount of humility, even as we're pressing them to do more. Think about it this way. In Lebanon, depending on how you calculate it, somewhere between a quarter and a third of the population is now comprised of Syrian refugees. Equate that to the United States, for those of you who are American. It's as if we were taking in the space of just a few years, 50 or 60 million people. And we know the debate that we've had over just taking in a few thousand. You can imagine what that would do in this country. And the challenge is similar in Turkey and similar in Jordan. But working together, working with them, there are practical solutions that can work, that can be sustainable for the local communities and really help the refugees as well. But that gets us to the third concentric circle that I wanted to talk to you about, and that's the international system itself. Because the truth is, the sheer number of people on the move, whether it's from Syria or from other countries around the globe, that has forced our traditional systems to stretch perilously close to the breaking point. We're all giving more than we've ever given before, and yet we can't keep pace with growing needs. Built to weather the emergencies of the 20th century, the global humanitarian system that we have today has to be adapted to face the challenges of the 21st. That's the third concentric circle. This May, we'll have leaders from around the world assembling in Istanbul for the first ever World Humanitarian Summit, and you've heard something about that over the last couple of days as well. And we're going to look to make some progress on three core objectives. First, we're going to reaffirm our commitment with a loud and hopefully unified voice to uphold international humanitarian law, to protect civilians, to condemn the willful denial of aid and routine attacks on clinics, on hospitals, on schools, even on humanitarian workers themselves. We do have rules of behavior as a global community. The regard for the sanctity of life remains one of the most fundamental tenets of our basic humanity, and it's lost at our great peril. Second, we're going to try to reinforce and update the fundamental structure of the humanitarian system to contend better with today's challenges. The system's priorities, its resources, its decisions have to be oriented toward the needs of the world's most vulnerable people rather than bent by the forces of politics or narrow mandates. And as you can imagine, that is a great challenge. Third, we're going to look to build new and greater coherence between our humanitarian efforts on the one hand and our development toolkit on the other hand, in order to strengthen resilience to cyclical droughts or recurring natural disasters and to these tides of displaced. One of the big disconnects in the system is exactly the one between humanitarian response on the one hand and the longer-term development efforts on the other hand. We have to collapse the barriers that exist between them just in the way we do things, because, like it or not, these problems, these challenges are going to be with us and with host communities, not for months, not even for a year, but for years and even decades. And unless a host community can see some benefit itself in supporting an influx of people from another country, it's not going to be politically, economically, physically sustainable. And so the development work that we're doing in response to these crises has to address the needs of refugees, but also has to address the needs of the countries that they've gone to. There is a way to turn some of this into a win-win proposition. Our experts and agencies are already collaborating in new ways, coordinating budgets, aligning projects, helping host countries include refugees in their own economic development plans. They're engaging the World Bank, other multilateral development banks in the private sector to identify long-term solutions that promote integration and growth. Despite the truly extraordinary budgetary pressure that they feel and face, middle-income countries like Jordan and Lebanon, they can't borrow at concessional rates, which are low-interest loans reserved for the poorest countries. So one of the things we're doing now is working with the World Bank to try to develop new types of affordable loans, with donors possibly stepping in to provide loan guarantees or grant financing alongside a loan to reduce the amount that countries actually have to borrow. So even as we're working on this World Humanitarian Summit and toward these goals, we're also preparing for something that will take place in September that President Obama has convened, and that is a leadership summit on the margins of the United Nations General Assembly to focus on the challenge of the global refugee crisis. And he will be asking governments around the world to step up in 3 ways. And these are asks that we're already in the process of making and that we hope will culminate in September at the summit. First, we're trying to broaden the donor base and increase contributions by 30% to chronically underfunded humanitarian appeals. We want to get countries that are already doing their part to do even more, and especially we want to get countries that have the means but haven't been participating in the system to actually join in. Humanitarian education support are not, unfortunately, one-time costs. Last year's funding gap for basic, life-saving humanitarian aid was a staggering 46%. That's the gap between what was asked for and needed and what was actually produced and delivered. Last summer, as the temperatures rose and desperation swelled, UN aid agencies were so short of funds that the World Food Program was forced to briefly cut rations for refugees. And throughout the year, UNHCR had to operate on just half the budget it requested as it grappled with these staggering and growing needs around the world. We just can't resign ourselves to these shortfalls. It's not acceptable, and we have to get other countries to step up as we're stepping up ourselves to do more. We need them to pitch in today with the same extraordinary generosity that we witnessed in the aftermath of an earthquake, of a tsunami, of a hurricane. Because for a generation of Syrians and for a generation of Syrian children, this crisis is a tsunami without the water. It is a 5-year hurricane without the wind. The second goal for the summit that we're bringing together in September is to try to double the number of refugees worldwide who are offered the safety of a permanent home and the chance for a fresh start through legal resettlement and other forms of admission. And this is an area of policy where all of us, including the United States, has to do better, and we're working to do that. Third and finally, we will try to expand opportunities for refugees to enjoy greater self-reliance through access to education, job training, and legal employment by increasing the number globally of children in school and adults working by 1 million each. Ultimately, however, no single NGO, no single humanitarian organization, no single country can meet the challenges of today alone. This is a time of unparalleled need, and every single one of us has a role to play and a responsibility to try to respond. So that brings me to the fourth and final concentric circle that I wanted to talk to you about, and that's all of us in this room and all of you. This community, your community, has its roots in 2 long-standing American traditions that also are shared widely around the world: innovation and philanthropy. Inspired by the benevolence of giants like Andrew Carnegie, Andrew Mellon, Leland Stanford, infused with entrepreneurial spirit of a new generation of Silicon Valley social investors, this community, your community, proves what is possible when you apply both your heart and your mind to a problem. And you know, I've seen this in my own travels, going around the world, talking to people in every part of our planet, government officials, individuals from all walks of life. And there's one thing almost without fail that attracts people around the world to the United States. It's not always our policies. And it isn't even our politics, hard as that may be to believe. What it is a desire that so many of you manifest to aim high. It's our courage to be willing to fail, our commitment to give back, our capacity to translate possibility into opportunity and into reality for all people. In other words, it's the profound attraction of our culture of innovation, entrepreneurship, volunteerism. That's what I hear around the world, every place I travel. And that's precisely the spirit and sense of purpose that we need to bring to this challenge today. The humanitarian crisis we face is in fact so immense that it has the perverse effect of providing almost limitless ways to help, to make a difference. As foundations, as philanthropists, as entrepreneurs, you can take risks and experiment in ways that government and the public sector cannot. You have more flexibility to put resources and expertise into promising ideas and quickly scale proven ones. You can pivot more nimbly. You can cast a wide net, knowing that the search for breakthroughs can also bring failure. Corporate partners can deepen their investments in education, in training, and then employing this next generation of talent. Community leaders can help schools in their own neighborhoods connect and partner with sister schools in the region. Technology executives can build donate buttons into their pages, just as Google did in September. 3 days later, it had raised $11.3 million for the refugee response. Education firms can work with humanitarian organizations on the ground to provide virtual learning platforms. Students can prototype new ideas like classrooms on wheels or language lessons on podcasts. And all of us can look at global problems in new ways, not as challenges over which to despair, but as great problems to solve. I was in Jordan at the end of last year, and sitting there with a group of Syrian refugees, 15, 16, 17 years old. And we were having a conversation about how they saw the future. And it was quite extraordinary because they, despite their circumstance, had a real vision for what they wanted to do in life. They had goals, they had dreams, and they still had a confidence that they could somehow realize them. One young woman wanted to be a fashion designer, another a doctor, a third wanted to be in computers. They all had specific careers, specific goals that they were looking at, and they spoke with actually remarkable clarity and passion about their future. And one of the things I was curious about was what was their access to computers? And what was interesting was that virtually all of them actually did have access. Some actually at the place that we were gathered, this was a UNICEF-run community center, but also even in their families, despite their circumstances, many, if not all of them, had at least one smartphone in their family. So we were talking about that, and I asked how many of them knew what an iPhone was. And I had my iPhone, and I pulled it out and said, "You guys know what this is?" And of course, pretty much all of them did. They all raised their hands. And then I asked them, "Do you know what company made the iPhone?" And a couple of them said, "Oh yeah, sure, Apple." And then I asked if they knew who had founded Apple. And they paused, and one person actually volunteered, "Oh yeah, Steve Jobs." And then I asked them if they knew where Steve Jobs' father had come from. And there was silence. And of course, the answer is Syria. Every young person in that room could be the next Steve Jobs. Our job is to help give them that opportunity. Thank you very much.